If you're watching and listening to this recording, it's because you were likely unable to be part of the workshops that we had on May 23rd to talk with land trusts about the goal of including private land conservation, privately conserved lands in the Canada 17% goal. At the actual workshop, a lot of this information was interspersed in a bunch of the discussion, but I wanted to record it here for anybody who hadn't been there so they could see some of this context information. The idea was this was presented as context upfront information, and then we had a discussion on a bunch of these topics afterwards. So, of course, the requisite Miistakis Institute description, but I'm sure you all know that. So the outline was to talk about the pathway to Target 1 structurally and where it came from, the concept of OECMs or other effective area-based conservation measures, and then some broader context on conservation planning. Then go into how we measure that, measuring conservation from the perspective of measuring the protection, also from the perspective of measuring the actual biodiversity provision, two very different things, the management process, and then quite a bit of discussion about the databases that are or could be used to capture all of those concepts. We dove into key questions and had quite a robust discussion around these. They all relate to the context information, so measuring biodiversity and conservation, OECMs, and the databases. And then we collected on flip chart sheets throughout the discussion recommendations that would be put forward to the Government of Alberta for a variety of reasons: Land Use Secretariat, regional planning, land trust grants programming, Government of Canada in the context of the pathway process, recommendations back to land trusts themselves, things that they could do differently that might help with this, and then recommendations about the databases and how they could be structured. So the context stuff started with the beginning, going right back to the Convention on Biological Diversity, where all of this target information came from. And I wanted to point out the vision statement, right, built into the strategic plan for biodiversity and where the IHG targets are. So by 2050, biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and wisely used, maintaining ecosystem services, sustaining a healthy planet, and delivering benefits essential for all people. So the thing I wanted to point out here is that there's a statement about biodiversity right at the beginning, but then the rest of this is about conserving, wisely using ecosystem services and a number of other kind of broader concepts well beyond simply protection or the protective measure. So the target 11 from the IHG targets from that strategic plan is the one that we think of as the 17% target. This is the way that it was originally written. By 2020, at least 17% of terrestrial and inland water areas and 10% of coastal and marine areas, especially areas of particular importance for biodiversity and ecosystem services, are conserved through effectively and equitably managed, ecologically representative, and well-connected systems of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, and integrated into the wider landscapes and seascapes. So the key points to pull out here, that target, we kind of reduce it just to the 17% of terrestrial and inland water areas. Areas of importance for biodiversity and ecosystem services. I think it's important to see that both of these concepts were identified and identified separately, discretely. And then a number of characteristics about how that would happen: effective, equitable, representative, connected systems. The protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, pointing out that these really are considered two different things. And then integrated into the wider landscape, which I think is also an important concept, especially when we're considering the OECMs and the private land conservation. Okay, so this is Canada's Target 1. This is our rewrite of the IHG Target 11, put in the context of Canada's strategic plan for biodiversity. So by 2020, at least 17% of terrestrial areas and inland water and 10% of coastal and marine areas are conserved through networks of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. So just comparing it to the IHG target, it still says 17%. Areas of importance for biodiversity, but removing all reference to ecosystem services. All of those components that refer to what that system would look like, characteristics of the system or the approach, were all removed. Protected areas and OECMs still maintained, and then that integrated into the wider landscape removed entirely. I think it's really important to understand that we have a very pared down version of Target 1 compared to what the Convention on Biological Diversity envisioned and what that IHG Target 11 looked like. So Each one of those targets, in both the case of Canada's system and the Convention on Biological Diversity, were all collected under a handful of goals. And the goal of Target 11 in the Convention on Biological Diversity is to improve the status of biodiversity by safeguarding ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity. And the goal that Canada's Target 1 sits under is, by 2020, Canada's lands and waters are planned and managed using an ecosystem approach to support biodiversity conservation outcomes at local, regional, and national scales. So the key thing to look at here, I think, is that the way that the Target 11 goal, or the goal that includes Target 11, is framed is around biodiversity and the number of characteristics around what they mean by biodiversity, whereas our goal is framed purely around management. Lands and waters are planned and managed using an ecosystem approach, outcomes at regional and national scale. So it really is shifting the focus away from provision of biodiversity, maintenance of biodiversity, understanding of biodiversity, to the mechanisms and measures, the protective mechanisms, and the way that the management would happen. This is kind of nuanced in the way that is written, but it becomes far less nuanced when you look at essentially the principal people involved in the Canadian Council for Ecological Areas, which represents the parks and land management agencies from across Canada. Pretty much every province and territory has some representation on that council, but they're all from a protected areas perspective. And they collected a number of information sources, held workshops, produced papers in this paper, which kind of gathered all of that perspective and all of those authors. Right in the abstract, it's pretty clear. It says, however, IHE Biodiversity Target 11 contains a significant policy and reporting challenge, conceding that both protected areas and OECMs could be used to meet national targets of protecting 17% of terrestrial areas, respectively. So key thing here, it's not represented as an opportunity. This is a significant policy and reporting challenge. And that having OECMs is a concession, conceding that OECMs can be used to meet national targets. So it starts right from the beginning as a very deprecating approach to anything that is not a traditional protected area. And yet these are the folks who lead on helping us identify what is or is not acceptable as a non-protected area, other than another protected area, being counted towards our 7% target. Okay, the pathway process, just to give some basic structure and background. Pathway to target conservation 2020. This is the overarching names are used for this national initiative, federal territorial initiative. There's a national advisory panel made up of knowledgeable representative citizens from across the country. The national steering committee is made up of the agencies within each one of the agencies represented across the country and other folks, but essentially that's the primary makeup. They were supported by or informed by expert task teams on a number of topics, including OECMs, all of whom finished their work, provided their guidance, not so much recommendations, but guidance back up to the national panel, whose report has been finished, but has not yet publicly released. Underneath the expert task team was a number of agency support people from all of the different federal and territorial PT agencies. And then the idea is that all of that goes to the ministers who as this reporting, they're theoretically meeting at the end of June, but it was the end of May, and before that it was March. So see how that happens. In terms of the Alberta response, still haven't prepared yet. It is coming forward in time for the meeting. But I think these of you, my guess, wins that they want to get before they make their final tally. And their response is basically their calculation. What percentage of Alberta's land base is in that 7%. Anish and Connie from the Alberta Environment and Parks Policy Integration Group is leading that, and I think that's significant. It's not being led by someone from parks, not being led by someone from public lands. It's about policy integration. So the idea is that team would bring together a number of perspectives. So watching with curiosity how they put together their response. So private land conservation and OECMs. I always joke that what is an OECM? It's that thing that isn't a park. It's sort of folks who are used to talking about protected areas trying to describe something that conserves biodiversity, but is not a quote unquote protected area. So there has been a lot of work done at the international level. The IUCN taking the lead on this, and the World Commission on Protected Areas within the IUCN taking that on as a task team project. Again, a little bit of a challenge that it's the Commission on Protected Areas who are trying to find this thing that is not protected areas. They have come up with a number of criteria, and I haven't updated this because a new document is just released. But they have tried to identify the things that the characteristics that would be part of an OECM. The idea is that at this international level, they come up with kind of standard guidance, but then each country interprets it how they want to. And then in the case of Canada and other countries, I'm sure, that will also be passed back to each jurisdiction within the Federation, every province and territory, to interpret as well. So my understanding is that an OECM definition has been created for Canada, and it will be circulated to all of the provincial and territorial jurisdictions, and that a deputy minister or assistant deputy minister level, there would be a review of that, and then ... I'm not sure exactly what. Would that all go back to be rolled up into a consensus-based consistent definition, or is it still just left to everybody to interpret? That's sort of a yet to be seen. The way that Canada has been measuring OECMs, and keep in mind, OECMs are not just private land conservation. They're a broad variety of things that can include things like grazing areas. It could include things like the Suffield weapons testing range. Any area that has some measure of protection but wasn't necessarily set up for conservation of biodiversity, or was not set up for conservation of biodiversity in many cases, but actually has that function and has protective mechanisms that would allow that. So the Canadian Council on Ecological Areas has developed a screening tool, which, my perspective, it's a very, again, parks-focused kind of screening tool, measuring how similar your suggested area is to a park. And the screening tool has a lot of criteria that are based around the management process, the legislative oversight, and very little about what is in fact contributing to conservation or maintenance of biodiversity. Anyways, the screening tool asks things like geographic scope, which makes sense because these are area-based. It's not like, for example, harvest restrictions, which conservation measures, but they're not about something spatially explicit drawn on a map. Scope of conservation objectives, and then they use the phrase biodiversity as a whole, which is problematic because it's unclear what that means, but the idea is if you're just trying to conserve some of the biodiversity and not every bit of biodiversity there, then it doesn't count. Primacy of nature conservation objectives, meaning if that isn't the primary goal, then it doesn't count. A number of things around governance, two things around effectiveness, and again, it's in the first case, power to control and manage. Do you have that legislative authority? And are you compelled to prohibit activities, again, sort of from the protection end rather than the measure of conservation? Long term, that makes sense. Dedicated, specifically identified within some mechanism that says that this is what the purpose is here. And then the timing referring to not short-term things, not just conserve for today and who knows about a week from Tuesday. The big challenge in, I think, this whole measuring screening tool is this ancillary tool that goes with it, the subsurface activity tool, which basically just says if you can't restrict subsurface activity, then it's not conserved, period, full stop. And it's again, a very protected areas kind of a approach, but essentially wipes out any private land conservation especially in our jurisdiction where we know that there is access to oil and gas activity. But it doesn't do anything based on how much of an impact, measuring whether there is actually a detriment or decrease to biological diversity. Is some decrease allowed or not? It's just, it overrides all other assessment criteria. I also wanted to mention that lots of focus on pathway, but there's other things in here. There's other reasons for this information to be out there in the hands of a lot of entities who should be using private land conservation information when they're doing their work, their planning. So regional planning. Taken straight from the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan, but more of an issue in the South Saskatchewan region since there's significantly more private land there, but the same kinds of ideas reflected in all regional plans. Achieving the objectives for biodiversity, healthy functioning ecosystems, and natural landscapes will require a full range of management approaches and tools in order to address the complex mix of public lands and private land and how they can contribute to those objectives. Lots of statements around we need to recognize the importance of private land, but not a lot of direction on what that means, what that looks like, how you account for it. The biodiversity management framework is supposed to take up a lot of that mantle, trying to clarify some of those things from a practical perspective. So the BMF will identify objectives and some key indicators related to grasslands, which could be a focus for voluntary private land conservation. The BMF will also provide guidance to the Land Trust Grant Program. So again, threads in there that if you don't have a clear understanding of what you mean by private land conservation and its contribution to biodiversity conservation, you have challenge measuring and doing this. But I think the other part of this that's really important is that there's a clear recognition within these plans that private land conservation is critical to meeting these goals. So again, getting this straight and clear is important for these initiatives. And without going into any detail, municipal planning, a number of initiatives around planning at the municipal development plan or area structure plan level, where knowing where private land conservation happens and being able to plan in conjunction with that is really important. Industrial operations, whether that's siting of power lines or siting of roads or siting of different kinds of aspects of the operation or the activities associated with the operation. The more they know about private land conservation in the area, the better. And then conservation planning in and of itself, whether that's for creating a protected area system and understanding where you should apply limited resources based on where lands are already conserved, species at risk, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of different aspects of conservation planning that really need to be conscious of where the private land conservation efforts are. Okay, switching gears a little bit to the measuring the conservation, and this, again, this sort of reflects back to all of the things that I've just been talking about, but I'm looking specifically at CARTS and Pathway to Target 1. CARTS is the Conservation Area Reporting and Tracking System, and it's the national system that we use to capture that information across the country and then report it to any international calculation of how much of Canada's land base is protected. The problem is that CART system is very, very focused, again, on mechanisms versus effectiveness. So it asks you to list the protection status, the IUCN category, what piece of legislation is overseeing this, what industrial activity prohibitions have been made or could be made. So very little about biodiversity. There's really only one field in that entire database, and it's a very, very broad one, that even speaks to the system. Now, it may be that one of the other task teams is under the pathway process. I mentioned there were a number of expert task teams. One of those is areas of importance for biodiversity and ecosystem services. Maybe that work will have more relevance for understanding that part, but it's certainly not reflected in the CARTS database. The CARTS database continues with land management categories, management objectives, not the outcomes, just the objective, and it's all drawn from the IUCN protected areas. Those protected areas categories that most people I think are familiar with. It's drawing from those and trying to equate as much as possible that system to those. That makes perfect sense for protected areas, and the CART system covers all kinds of protected areas, but it gets a little bit creaky and square peg round hole when you try and do private land conservation. So in terms of private land conservation, this OECM screening tool that was created is very challenging. It's, like I've said before, it's about how similar is this to a protected area. But right from that very first Convention on Biological Diversity statement, the idea is there are protected areas and OECMs. It shouldn't be a surprise when you come to find that an OECM doesn't look like a protected area. That is your starting point. They are not protected areas. So we need to have a different system, is I think my summary point there. And all of the efforts to try and do this, to do the screening, the testing, just seem to come from the perspective of OECMs there's an inconvenience there and a sneakiness, and they're going to try and get something past us, and we're going to ramp up all of these numbers to 17% without having any truly effectively protected areas, which I think is a bit of a distraction. Even if you add up all of the sneaky private land conservation that might want to try and get its way in, it's probably less than 1%. It's a very small land base, but has huge potential for the future and huge potential for a lot of that integration into wider landscape and those kinds of messages. So we sort of lose a lot of that when we focus purely on how similar are they to a protected area. So just to talk about some of the databases, like how do we actually capture this information? In Alberta, land titles, I think of it as sort of our base tool, because everything, whether it's a fee simple property or conservation easement, has to be registered on title. But there's limited conservation information. It's about ownership. It's about interest in the land, but you have to dig pretty hard to get any sort of conservation information. The EcoGIFs program maintains a database, Environment and Climate Change Canada, the Canadian Wildlife Service. Prairie Region has been maintaining a database since the 90s, but of course that's only EcoGIFs, and it's not a publicly accessible system. As I've said, CARTS, our national reporting system for protected areas, it's currently managed by the Canadian Council for Ecological Areas, but my understanding is that's now shifting to be something that is managed by the Canadian Wildlife Service under the aegis of the whole pathway process. So one, that's shifting, but two, the important thing is as it shifts, I think there will be changes. So it creates an opportunity for us to say, maybe there should be some changes that better accommodate understanding of privately conserved areas. Some provinces do report private land conservation into that database. I should mention it's the provincial agencies who represent each one of the provinces. They're the ones who put the information in there. I think the Nature Conservancy and Ducks Unlimited do put information directly in, but primarily it's the provinces. And there are, I believe, 5 provinces who report on private land conservation to some degree, none that report in a comprehensive way. In Alberta, the Land Stewardship Centre has a couple of registries. There's the Conservation Easement Registry and the Conservation Lands Registry. The Conservation Easement Registry does an automated query of the land title system, so it brings up information about about conservation easement existence and where in the province by quarter section that exists. Doesn't come up with area-based information or conservation purposes or any of that sort of thing. And they've maintained a conservation lands registry for some time as a fee-for-service search that is used by usually industrial operators who are wanting to know if there are conservation mechanisms of any sort in the area that they're proposing to be active in. Land Stewardship Centre did create a new database for the Land Use Secretariat. It was actually put out to tender. Land Stewardship Centre bid on it and was successful, created that system, which my understanding is it's a fairly broad purpose system, lots of client-focused services. So for example, if you're a medium-sized land trust, you would be able to have a back-end access where you're storing your information about your conservation properties, not necessarily public-facing for that kind of information. Designed, created, provided back to the Land Use Secretariat, and then the people who had commissioned it left the Land Use Secretariat, and my understanding is it has languished since then. Speaking of the Land Use Secretariat, they recently started creating a conservation easement database, pulling all the historical conservation easement records from land titles, trying to tease out not just that an easement exists there, but where it is, spatially explicit information about the location, number of acres, the conservation purposes. The idea was to make this publicly accessible so that anybody could have access to that information. but the people creating it are now on secondment, the main one I think for 2 years, so that's another system that will languish. Um, Internal systems, most land trusts have their own system for tracking. Some of those systems are shared with each other, usually in sort of bilateral agreements, but nothing that is open and accessible and usable in a planning context for any of those planning initiatives that I talked about, those calculations. So I just wanted to mention briefly a couple of other database models outside of Alberta, outside of Canada actually, as something for us to think about as we try and figure out how we address this data issue. So the National Conservation Easement Database in the United States tracks all conservation easements in the country. And go onto that system, you're able to download shape files or bring up a web-delivered mapping system that shows you where those conservation easements are, metadata associated with that. All of it starts out by saying these are not publicly accessible lands, and is very clear about that. And then basic fields around who is the easement holder. No information about the landowner, just the easement holder. Contact information, who provided the data, when it was most recently updated, all of that kind of thing. The state of Virginia has been maintaining a conservation lands database since 1998, a digital conservation lands base since 1998. And what they have maintained is two separate databases, one with all protected areas within the state, and then except for conservation easements, and then a separate one that is just conservation easements. All of those are web accessible, shapefiles and metadata for each one of those databases. In Australia, they have what they call the Collaborative Australian Protected Areas Database. Every 2 years, they formally update it, and they document all protected areas in the country. And they've been doing that for a number of years, and in the last several years have updated it to include private reserves and covenants, or fee simple lands held by conservation organizations, and conservation easements. That's their terminology for it. They gather all of that information, and again, it's available in shapefiles for public download and use in any sort of planning initiatives. So that is the end of the context information that was provided at the workshop.